Welcome to Buildings and Beyond,
the podcast that explores how we can create a more sustainable built environment
by focusing on efficiency, accessibility, and health.
I'm Rob Aldrich.
And I'm Kelly Westby.
Hey guys, Alex Mrobley here, Buildings and Beyond producer and editor. Recently I had the pleasure of chatting with Peter Stratton, who is the Managing Director of Accessibility Services here at Stephen Winter Associates. I was listening back to his first Buildings and Beyond episode, which was recorded back in 2018, and I wanted to hear what has changed in the accessibility world since then. Specifically, I've been hearing the term inclusive design used more frequently. I wanted to make sure I wasn't confusing it with universal design. That gave me the idea to rerun his original episode, but started off with an explanation of inclusive design versus universal design. Here's what Peter had to say.
It would not be wrong to use the terms inclusive design and universal design interchangeably. In fact, that is typically how they are used. But for Stephen Winter Associates, we, as of late, are proceeding in a different way with a fresh approach that we are calling inclusive design. And let me explain. Universal design is commonly understood to mean designing for essentially the greatest number of people, regardless of age, ability, stature, and so on. It's performance-based design and not prescriptive-based design, which is essentially accessibility, compliance, and consulting, which is a little bit different. So it's performance-based. So if a building is being designed to accommodate children, we would design it based on the needs of children. Versus a facility designed to accommodate seniors, we would include design strategies which speak specifically to the needs of seniors. And so that's what I mean by performance-based versus prescriptive-based. Prescriptive, or accessibility, compliance, and consulting, is really about meeting the requirements of a law, a code, a standard, regardless of whether the facility accommodates seniors or children. We meet one design baseline standard, very prescriptive. Our approach to determining how well a building performs combines the traditional approach, and that is the traditional approach meaning sustainability, energy efficiency, typically being linked to building performance. We are now bringing in inclusive design to the building performance picture. So our approach to determining how well a building performs combines that traditional approach with innovative design strategies that consider disability, gender, culture, LGBTQ plus identity, and language, among other factors of human diversity. And that holistic approach is what we are calling true inclusive design. So for Stephen Winter Associates, inclusive design incorporates aspects of universal design, accessibility, sustainability, energy efficiency, and holistically, all of what I just mentioned is what we are calling inclusive design. Now, it's not wrong to continue to use the term universal design, but we see it as different than inclusive design. And as I mentioned to you, inclusive design includes aspects of accessibility, sustainability, universal design, and so on. And when we speak about inclusive design, we're speaking about all components holistically.
I found Peter's explanation especially helpful. Hopefully you did too. Now, let's roll into Rob and Peter's original discussion, which serves as an excellent primer for those interested in learning more about accessibility compliance and why it is critical for health, equity, and improving the built environment.
So one of my big focuses of this podcast, one of my big interests is to talk more with people in this company. I mean, the company's not huge, 125 people or so, but we do a lot of different things. And accessibility is one of the things that I'm really not very familiar with. So when we decided to do this podcast, I said, all right, I want to interview Peter Stratton first.
All right.
And I told you, and you said, fantastic. And then you left the country for 2 weeks.
That's right.
So what's up with that, Pete?
I'm back now, though. I was investigating accessibility in Machu Picchu.
Hey, I look forward to the report. I guess first we're talking about accessibility, and people know what it is in a vague sense. But do you have a good working definition or an official definition or?
Working definition. So when we talk about accessibility in the context of what we do here at Stephen Winter Associates, accessibility really means that a building, a space, a facility is in compliance with a requirement or a criteria. Excuse me. So when we say, is the building accessible, we really mean, does it comply with the requirements that are applicable to the building?
Okay. And the term universal design, I hear a lot. Is that kind of a above and beyond term?
Yeah. So there are many terms. Accessibility is what when we talk about accessibility, again, we mean compliance with a requirement. When we talk about universal design or inclusive design, we talk about sort of going beyond compliance and accommodating the needs of a variety of potential building users, versus accessibility, which focuses mostly on accommodating the needs of people with disabilities.
Okay, gotcha.
So that's the distinction.
And accessibility, the legal requirements for accessibility are a big enough stretch for some people that going above and beyond is, we don't get into that too much.
We do get into it often enough, but universal design for the most part is not a requirement of federal, state, or local law or building codes. There are universal design requirements that are out there, but not to the extent that accessibility requirements exist.
Okay. So when did it start? When did you start working it? When did accessibility requirements come on the books?
Yeah, well, we've been working on accessibility for many years. I personally celebrate my 25th anniversary here at Stephen Winter Associates this month, but we haven't been working on it that long, almost that long. Many years ago, we were a contractor to HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research. And OPDNR at that time had RFPs out on the street for contractors who could get involved in some early research on the Fair Housing Amendments Act.
And that was new?
That was new at the time, certainly. The law, Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, when we talk about the Fair Housing Act, subsequent to the passing of the Fair Housing Amendments Act, the industry was kind of confused about having to comply with the legalese of a federal regulation and also with the requirements of a building code or criteria.
And they weren't there. I mean, there was an overlap. So this was legislation, not building code.
This is federal legislation in addition to building code that applied at the time. And an architect, for example, understands building code and criteria, technical standards, and at that time, a little bit confused about the legalese of a federal regulation, which they at that time learned that they need to comply with. And so there was some early research on what it all sort of really meant for the industry, and we were involved in that early research. And then it sort of snowballed from there. And here we are all these years later with a significant number of people on the team doing a lot of great stuff.
Cool.
Yeah,
cool.
Very cool.
And is it now mostly with developers we're working with? I mean, what's the stretch? I mean,
so our clients run the gamut. We work with a whole bunch of stakeholders, right? So architects, developers, contractors, public agencies, and lots of attorneys, because it is very litigious, as you can imagine. And we've got developers and other entities that are sued often for noncompliance with requirements, and we do a lot of that litigation consulting. So working with a lot of attorneys these days. But for the most part, I'd say we work primarily with developers and architects. That's sort of the bread and butter.
Okay, so new construction.
New construction, the requirements, depending, also cover existing construction, alterations, renovations. But I think our bread and butter for the most part is new construction, multifamily housing.
And so is that separation between legislation and codes still present? Has it gotten better, or has legislation outpaced codes and codes are trying to catch up? How does that work?
It's a mixed bag. So in the very beginning, we had the legalese of federal regulations to worry about when we design and construct facilities.
Okay.
And I'm talking about housing, but we have other federal requirements like the ADA that apply to facilities that are non-housing facilities like
so fair
accommodations.
housing obviously is housing, and then ADA.
Fair housing is housing, yeah. And the ADA is public accommodation and commercial facilities. That's Title III of the ADA. And Title II of the ADA covers activities of states and local governments. So if the local government does have a housing type of a facility like a shelter, although it is housing, it is also subject to ADA Title II because it's an activity of a state or a local government, I should say. So federal regulations have to be complied with in addition to the building code. In the very beginning, many years ago, it was a tough kind of nut to crack. What's more stringent, what takes precedence over the other. I really only need to worry about the requirements of the building code when it comes to access, because that's enough to get me in compliance with federal regulation, which is not true. And so that was the sentiment at that time. And
again, we're talking 90s?
We're talking early 90s, mid 90s. Now a lot has changed. The more current editions of the building code, and I'm talking about the International Building Code, way when all these federal regulations came into play, we didn't have the International Building Code. We had a number of different building codes like BOCA or the Southern Building Code, that covered different jurisdictions across the country. Now, for the most part, we have the International Building Code, and it has Chapter 11 accessibility in it. And it has, attempted to keep up with the requirements of federal law. There are some editions of the International Building Code, for example, that are approved by HUD as safe harbors for compliance with the design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Amendments Act. A safe harbor is a document that you can turn to that when you comply with that document from beginning to end, you essentially comply with the requirements of fair housing.
And so HUD will review a code and say, all right, this meets all our checklists.
That's right.
Okay.
And HUD has done that, but they stopped at the International Building Code 2006. And now we're up to 2018.
Yeah.
So HUD is sort of lagging. Building codes have progressed.
And the accessibility requirements of legislation also have progressed or evolved? Or?
No. Fair Housing Amendments Act has remained the same. The Americans with Disabilities Act has been updated, and there have been criteria that have been updated. But editions of the International Building Code beyond 2006 have not been approved by HUD as safe harbors for compliance.
Okay. All right. So presumably they didn't backtrack on their accessibility measures.
That's right.
But
I think things have gotten better, and the trend is sort of improved accessibility in the building codes for sure, but still not a HUD-approved safe harbor.
All right. Okay.
And it's not that there's nothing in the legalese of the law that tells you that you've got to comply with a HUD-approved safe harbor.
It's just a service for really to try to get accessibility into standard practice. Because, developers, builders have to deal with codes. Architects, everybody has to deal with codes. They know how to deal with codes.
That's right.
And now you throw a piece of legislation at them, and it's like,
I think I would have agreed with that statement 20 years ago. But today, for an industry key stakeholder to say, hey, look, I'm a little confused with this law, or I understand my building is not compliant, but I get the building code. I'm not really familiar with. It's I think a little bit too late for that. It's been around for many, 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 many years at this point, and so you try and learn and grow, and I think what has changed from now to then is that the industry, I think, realizes now that accessibility really is its own sort of niche practice area.
It's a thing. You got to do it.
Right.
It's like efficiency. I mean, codes didn't used to address efficiency. It was, structural safety, fire safety.
You've got to do it. Right. And you rely on the accessibility consultant just like you would rely on any specialty consultant, the acoustics consultant, right? The landscape consultant, the mechanical consultant. The architect is not developing or designing mechanical systems and is not doing acoustics, probably for the most part. So how can you expect an architect to essentially be paid what they're paid and also understand all of the nuts and bolts of a federal regulation in addition to the building code? I think it's just way too much to expect. So,
all right. So what are some of the nuts and bolts? I mean, what are some of the things that people fail to comply with? Some common things that just require some extra thought or some extra planning or some...
Yeah, people fail to comply with. That's a great question. I think what trips people up, and when I say people, I think for the most part designers or architects and interior designers.
Speaking as a designer and architect.
Speaking as one of those professionals, yes. And just based on the experience, what I see every day. All of the codes, the federal laws, the state laws, local legislation, all have what's called scoping criteria and technical criteria. So the scoping criteria is what needs to be accessible. For example, how many building entrances are required to be accessible? How many bathrooms are required to be accessible? And then you turn to technical criteria for direction on how to make an entrance accessible. The clear width of the door, the maximum opening pressure, maneuvering clearance on both sides, the hardware type, closing speed, all of that.
Okay.
The technical criteria, I think, are pretty simple. You go to the criteria, you open the book, and you follow the steps. The door clearance has to be, or the door has to provide a clear width of no less than 32 inches, measured between the face of the door and the opposing stop when the door is open 90 degrees. That's simple.
All right.
I think it's scoping criteria in terms of how many, how much that sort of confuses architects and designers. And that's where we see, I think, the mistakes being made. The building code, for example, in New York City requires that all public entrances are accessible. Americans with Disabilities Act requires that 60% of public entrances are accessible. The Fair Housing Amendments Act requires that at least one primary entrance be accessible. So if you have a building that is subject to a number of federal requirements, which many are, in addition to building code, you've got different scoping requirements and you've got different technical requirements to comply with. So it's understanding what to apply and sort of what governs, what rule you've got to follow. And so it's mostly the scoping information that's what trips designers
So it's
up.
not necessarily getting the details right. Something has to be a dimension of X and it's dimension of X plus 1 inches or
Yep. I want to say yes, but then again, when I think about it, the devil's in the details.
Yeah.
It's all about the details, really.
Okay.
I think it's the scoping criteria that just, if you don't iron out the scoping criteria, how many and what right at the onset, and you can continue to design the project, very difficult to correct. You've got yourself in a hole, correct. When it comes to the technical criteria, bevels on thresholds, maximum threshold height, clear width at doors. There's lots that we need to think about in order to meet the technical requirements. So to say that a 32-inch door needs to provide a clear width of 32 inches, does a 210 door work? Should you default to a 36-inch door because you have a different or an odd hinge on a 210 door?
Oh, man.
So the devil is in the details,
All right.
certainly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, have the requirements, I don't know if hinges is a good example, but has the legislation evolved to kind of make these requirements more practical, more buildable, or I think I heard someone talk about like ranges, and it used to mandate a dimension of X. Now it's a dimension of X plus or minus an inch or something to allow
So
some wiggle room.
the criteria the requirements have definitely progressed. Not as fast as the law itself, So we've got technical standards that change and develop every so many years. A federal regulation does not do that. The law stays in place. The technical criteria change over time.
All right. Gotcha.
That said, though, the Americans with Disabilities Act has recently been updated, but the Fair Housing Amendments Act has not been updated, and either have other federal laws. So although the laws can change, they primarily stay the same, and it's the technical criteria that change.
Gotcha.
So what was required by a technical standard technical standard dated in 1998, very different than the same technical standard, which is now dated in latest one, 2009, 2017, coming on board. So there are committees that develop these criterias. They also learn as we build over time. And so one of the things that we often hear is, is there any tolerance? The requirement is 18 inches, a distance of 18 inches between the center line of a toilet and the adjacent side wall, for example.
Okay.
It's very tough to meet that hard line 18 in construction, right? Construction is not a perfect science.
Yeah.
So the criteria have moved away from that hard line 18 and now contemplate a range of between 16 and 18, which is much easier
more
to comply with, right?
Gotcha.
Much more sort of builder-friendly and much more practical, I'd say.
Yep.
And so that's where we are with the criteria.
So with projects that go well, that you're involved, I kind of assume it's kind of a soup to nuts process. Involved with designers early on and through construction and verifying after construction. How?
Yep. So it runs the gamut. If we could have our wish, of course, it would be to be involved at schematic design. So we can advise on the direction that the designer is going in terms of designing the units. Normally we provide 2 comprehensive reviews, but we don't only stop at the architectural review, right? We're reviewing all the plan sets, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and architectural. So it's just not the spaces. We've got
what on mechanical? What do you have to inspect mechanical drawings for?
So we're looking, for example, for information on thermostats, which you usually find. Right. We're looking height.
Okay, height of the thermostat.
That's right. Often times there are chase walls which obstruct into maneuvering clearance at doors, for example.
I can
and so
totally
the mechanical
see that.
chases, plumbing chases, there are a whole variety of things. And often...
You say mechanical engineers might draw ducts where they might interfere with somebody?
Sometimes. I think it's more likely, though, that we might have a plumbing set that's misaligned or that doesn't align with the architectural set. So, for example, in a bathtub, in a bathroom or a shower, we'll see the architect has designed the control wall where the operable parts to the shower and the tub is.
All right.
The plumbing set may have the same controls, but on an opposing wall. And so we often find that the plan sets are not aligned.
They're just trying to minimize their plumbing runs. They're trying to make it more practical for them. Okay.
Well, the architect put the controls on an exterior wall, and then in the plumbing, they go from the exterior wall, to an interior wall.
Yep.
And so the building is now constructed with the plumbing on the interior wall because that's what the plumbing set, because they pull the plumbing set, and that's what they're building from.
Yep.
But there's a reason why the architect put the plumbing controls on the exterior wall.
Gotcha.
And so when you bust up plumbing controls or control locations, that's very, very difficult to fix, if it's sometimes not possible at all.
So people are doing better in general. I mean, are people catching on?
I think people are doing better in general. Yes. Years ago, it was difficult to convince a design team that they should have their plans reviewed and they should have construction inspected along the way during various stages of construction, which is what we do. But I think people have learned.
The hard way?
Sometimes the hard way, yes, certainly. I think what's important to realize is that when we're talking about, designing and constructing multifamily housing, if the building is not built in compliance with the design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Amendments Act, you are violating someone's civil right. And so to violate a building code is one thing. To violate a civil right, different thing, and that's why you hear about so much litigation that surrounds non-compliance with the Fair Housing Amendments Act.
Gotcha.
We used to hear years ago the developer say, we rely on our architect to get this right. They're the design professional. Why do I need to hire a separate accessibility consultant? But they have since learned that they probably shouldn't rely only on the architect.
Gotcha.
And there are certainly architects that are very great at it, but again, it's a very specialized field. It certainly is.
So if we were to talk again in 5 years, what do you think we'd be talking about? What would have changed?
Wow, 5 years from now, I would say that based on the trend that we are seeing now, and our group here at Stephen Winter Associates has grown pretty significantly over a very short number of years. The work is certainly coming in at a good rate. I think that we might see in 5 years probably less of an uptick in litigation. And hopefully that's as a result of people retaining accessibility consultants to do the work like us. Got to give the old plug, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting it right the first time.
Yeah.
And not going through the hard way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's I think you started out as more on the litigation side and have really tried to migrate more and more with builders, developers, designers to get it right.
Definitely started on the litigation side. And when we started, litigation was the only way. To hurt someone in the pocket is the way to get them to learn, and so that was the sort of the press in terms of enforcement at that time.
Okay.
And at that time, the model, of course, was cases that involved complaints against industry, architects, developers, and we today our model is to work on behalf of industry and to help industry navigate litigation should it make its way into litigation, and that's what all of our litigation projects now involve, helping industry navigate litigation. And I think that starting in litigation has enabled us to have a very keen sense of how decisions are made that surround particular issues. What the court might sort of be lenient on, what the court might press.
Yep.
What happens in New York City versus same litigation outside of New York City. What happens in a jurisdiction when attorney XYZ is involved in the case versus the same type of litigation that doesn't involve this particular attorney.
All right.
And so we've learned that as a result of the business, and I think that's the value that we bring.
All right. Nice.
Yeah, I think so.
Anything else? Any other big picture accessibility points?
Big picture accessibility points. Not that I can think of offhand, Rob. Of course, we might need to do a better job in getting this particular office a little bit more accessible, but this is radio and we can't see that.
You can send me some notes. I'll get right on it.
I'll do that.
Cool. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. For more info, check out the show notes at swinter.com/podcast. That's swinter.com/podcast. Buildings and Beyond is brought to you by Stephen Winter Associates. Our goal is to improve the built environment. If you're on a similar mission, consider checking out our careers page. We currently have over 30 openings across our DC, New York City, Connecticut, and Boston offices. If you have any ideas for episodes, suggestions for guests, or general feedback about the podcast, we would love to hear it. You can get in touch by emailing podcast@swinter.com. Again, podcast@swinter.com.